Welcome to City and State TV. I'm Executive Editor Michael Johnson. I'm joined today by Jimmy Van Bramer, the Majority Leader of the New York City Council, and he's kind enough to invite us to his office to chat a little bit about the budget that the mayor unveiled yesterday, his executive budget, which is $78 billion. I wanted to get your initial reaction first, and then we'll talk a little bit about the specifics. So what was your initial reaction?
Overall, it's a good budget. I think I appreciate the mayor's commitment to protecting the poor, those who have less in New York City. I particularly like the capital infusion when it comes to infrastructure. And I overall think that it's a fair and balanced budget, but obviously I have several particular issues with the budget that now we get to battle over as we move towards budget adoption. But I think generally good marks with a couple of notable failures.
And before we get to the failures, or the things that you perceive as failures, how does this process play out for you? Do you feel like, I mean, obviously as someone who's been around city government for a while now, do you feel like working with the mayor's office, this mayor's office, has been more of a collegial approach to it as opposed to the previous mayor?
You know, I think that we have a very good, solid working relationship, and I certainly appreciate my relationship with the mayor and his senior staff, and I do think that the senior staff in particular and the commissioners, almost without exception, are very accessible and very responsive, so I definitely think there's a working relationship. To be fair, I had that relationship with a lot of folks in the Bloomberg administration as well, so I don't mean to throw them under the bus. I think that there were folks who were incredibly responsive there as well, and you could get work done, and we did get work done. But I definitely think there is a closer working relationship, at least in my case, with the mayor and his senior staff and the commissioners, and generally speaking, very responsive. And in the budget, I think you saw some responses and some evidence of that in some areas, and then in others, not so much.
And one of the areas that the City Council had been asking for was the additional police officers, 1,000 additional police officers. The mayor did not put that in his executive budget. He didn't even seem to address that concern that you guys had raised. Is it better that he didn't address it, or would you rather he addressed it and specifically said, like, this is not something that I'm pushing for?
Well, it certainly came up in our briefing with the mayor, the City Council's briefing with the mayor, and I know the press has certainly asked him to address that omission, and I think that he was pretty clear that he kind of thinks that the way it's operating and some of the efficiencies that have been generated allow them to continue to operate safely in the way that they are. Clearly, the City Council feels differently, that we could benefit greatly from these 1,000 additional police officers, and I support the Speaker and all the members who feel very strongly about this. I think we are a little confused and perplexed as to why the mayor hasn't embraced this really in any way, shape, or form at this point, but I'm hoping that through the budget negotiation we'll get there, and he will see that we can continue to do all of the great things and make all the investments that he's making, rightly so, in homeless services and other key critical issue areas, while also beefing up the NYPD. I think you can do both. I think the mayor is somewhat concerned that to take some resources and add them to the NYPD would take them away from other areas that are clearly very high priorities for him.
Do you see this as a kind of a negotiating point? You guys want 1,000 police officers. He doesn't want to add any. You can meet somewhere in the middle, or do you think this is like just an ideological thing he doesn't want to add to the police force?
I think it's probably a little both. You know, I think that there are some things, both the police, libraries, where the mayor seems to have agreed to leave that to the negotiating. Obviously, I'm disappointed on both of those levels. I would have liked for the executive budget to have reflected those priorities of the council, and I actually believe the vast majority of the people in the city of New York, they chose not to do that. That's certainly within their rights, and now we fight forward. But I do think it's a little bit of both. I think the mayor has been pretty clear that he thinks that the department is working well, the city is safer than ever, and they can do the job and they can do it well. Clearly, Commissioner Bratton has departed from that line and seems to agree more with us, and so now we move to the negotiating phase, and you know, there are things to be worked out. That's one of them.
You're optimistic that you think there will be some level of increase of police officers by the time we get to July 1st?
You know, I don't want to characterize it as optimism. I would say that I'm hopeful that this can get done. I certainly think the council is nearly unanimous in feeling very strongly about this, and you know, the speaker has put this forward as a big part of her platform. So I'm hopeful that the administration will come to the table and get this done with us. And obviously we want 1,000, and we're not going to negotiate against ourselves and start talking about lesser numbers.
All right. Moving on to libraries, you're obviously the chair of the Cultural Affairs, so libraries are a big deal for you. Cultural affairs in general, obviously a big issue that you've been pushing for, and it seems like you were a little bit you know, disappointed in the amount of funding that went into this year's budget. Kind of recap what you're thinking of the executive budget when it comes to libraries specifically.
Sure. Well, there are two different pots which it's important to talk about, right? There's the capital and the expense. And we've made the case, I think, incredibly well over the last year that the situation for libraries as they relate to capital, infrastructure, upkeep, maintenance is absolutely in a state of crisis, and with the needs somewhere in the billion-dollar range. That's documented, that's proven. The administration in my committee meetings agreed that that's actually the number. It's not a made-up number. So we've pushed incredibly hard for the administration to include libraries in the 10-year capital plan. Libraries had never before been in the 10-year capital plan. And they did do that for the first time ever. $300 million was included in the 10-year capital plan. That is not the $1 billion that is needed, but it is historic in the sense that public libraries now are in the 10-year capital plan, $300 million on top of what was there, so now it's a $902 million capital program plan for libraries in the city of New York. That's historic. That's a good step forward. I am pleased that the administration responded to our campaign and to all of the cries for help. Obviously, it is only a first step, and we need that $1 billion. So this is a good first step that I thank the mayor for, and am pleased that they have chosen to invest in libraries. Having said that, we need to come back and add to this 10-year capital plan and make sure that we are getting more capital dollars into libraries. Now, on the expense side, I think that was clearly a disappointment because libraries, you know, and I have to be honest, this is one of those areas where I don't understand why the mayor has not provided the same level of commitment to our public libraries as he has to other issue areas that clearly benefit the poor, the working poor, immigrants in the city of New York. That commitment is great when it comes to Department of Homeless Services and other issue areas, but not when it comes to our public libraries. And we need $65 million to get every single library in the city of New York open 6 days a week. That was where we were in 2008 before a series of budget cuts in the Bloomberg era. Last year at budget adoption, I pushed very hard, and we were able to include $10 million extra funding for libraries. That's a restoration, part restoration. That wasn't baselined, and we would love to have that baselined. There was an opportunity to do that in the executive budget. They did not take that opportunity. So that just makes our fight in the budget negotiations that much harder, an extra $10 million lift. We need the $65 million. That's a real need. And so it is fair for the library systems and for library lovers and users all across the city to be disappointed in the executive budget when it comes to the expense side, in particular for libraries. Now, I believe the mayor cares about libraries. I believe the mayor believes that libraries are a good thing for the city of New York, and I believe he knows how important libraries have been with the IDNYC campaign, where they've served as intake centers. I believe he understands how important libraries are. They are the first stop for many in our immigrant communities because all of the services and programs, including English language learning classes, are free at our public libraries. So, you know, but I think it's fair to say that I'm disappointed and slightly confused as to why libraries aren't higher up on the priority list for the mayor. And so I'm hopeful that in this budget negotiation process, we'll be able to get there, get to the $65 million, and get our libraries open. I know the mayor cares, rightly so, in a very, very passionate and meaningful way about ending inequality in the city. Mm-hmm. And I applaud him and support him and work with him on that. But libraries are essential in the fight against inequality. There is no other institution that is so prolific in every single neighborhood, that is open as long as we fund them just about every day, with all of these services, technology included, that are free for every single person, no questions asked. And I want the mayor to be more of a champion of libraries, without question, and it's our job to help get him there.
So you feel like it's maybe just a sense of priorities for him, obviously, like the larger message and the mission of kind of improving the lives of those who are less fortunate in the city, bridging the inequality gap. I mean, the mayor did a lot of things in the budget to address that with NYCHA funding and several other issues as well. Do you think it's maybe just a situation where he feels like libraries are not as important a part of that, and you're just trying to convince him of that? And is there support amongst the rest of your council members? Because I know a lot of your council members are very, very happy with the added funding for NYCHA, for example, and they would probably rather have the money go to NYCHA than to libraries, potentially.
Well, I won't characterize the mayor's decisions in terms of libraries being less of a priority or somehow less important, and so therefore the funding went to NYCHA or other areas. I believe that you can do both. You can do all of the above, and that libraries are the critical bridge and really the partner of our NYCHA developments and our homeless shelters and all of the other institutions that are really geared towards lifting people up out of poverty and empowering folks. Libraries are an important bridge to all of those things. So I think it's part of it, and obviously it's the mayor has a certain set of challenges, right? There's a certain amount of funding available, and then he has the ability in many cases to allocate funding. I don't want to say that libraries are less important to him. That's for him to say. What I will say is what I have said, which is that the budgets that the mayor proposes and works out should reflect more of a priority for libraries, and that's got to include more funding, and it's got to include more on the expense side. As to the council, there were several council members in our private briefing with the mayor yesterday who talked about libraries, not just myself. So I believe that the city council does support our public libraries, does get how important they are. All of us have several libraries in our districts and hear from our constituents, but we need to work this out together, and we need a joint commitment. And the mayor had an opportunity with the executive budget to really tackle the issue of funding for libraries. I think that's a missed opportunity on the expense side, but we are not done yet. We're not done fighting. We have 6 or 7 weeks to work this out. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do that.
Do you have a sense maybe that you know, because he's added the libraries to the capital plan now, that's kind of like a first step, and you know, he's maybe taking a cautious approach as to what the budget for the next 10 years will be, and what the financing and the amount of revenue that will be there for the next 10 years. And maybe there's a possibility that this is kind of like would be a first step, and then next year there could be more funding for libraries. Or do you just feel like it needs to be a commitment that's made now?
I do believe it's a commitment that should be made now. But to be fair, I think the mayor was, at least in the briefing to council members, pretty clear about wanting to be a good steward and to be very cautious in terms of a potential downturn in the next few years. So yes, he does have to be mindful of how much money is put up now. And I do, again, want to say that the capital infusion, $300 million, while not everything we need, was a sign by this administration that they believe this is an important issue worthy of a $300 million investment, right, over the next 10 years. So, you know, I believe that the mayor is always thinking, as he should be, about how much and how soon and then anticipating what could be a downturn in a couple of years. But I do think that libraries, first of all, the expense number is relatively small. I mean, obviously it's a $78 billion budget. We're talking about $65 million on the expense side. I think we could restore that funding, baseline it, and not break the bank, so that even if we hit a downturn, which in some ways is inevitable, given the cyclical nature of the economy, we could still maintain that level of service. And I think the mayor is acutely aware that in past downturns, there's been a reduction of service and budget cuts, which were devastating in so many areas, including to libraries. We don't want to go there again, right? We've baselined the core of library service, but we need to get to the 65 million, baseline it, and then protect it through that future downturn. We can do that without blowing a hole in this budget. $65 million is not that big of a challenge.
You kind of struck on, and this will be my final point on the libraries, but you kind of struck on this, I think, ideological point, whereas, you know, times are somewhat good right now. You have money to invest in things. Do you invest in projects to advance the city in some way or whatever, or do you invest in the safety net that people might need when there is a downturn? Do you think there's some level of an ideological I guess, divide there? Do you think the mayor is focusing on building up that safety net in anticipation for this downturn, or do you think he's more like, this is my opportunity to invest in certain things because I'm not going to be able to do in the downturn?
I think he did both. I mean, I think the mayor was incredibly prudent in establishing reserves and building reserves that don't exist, even a firewall on the Capitol side. So I think he's doing both at the same time, which is exactly what he should be doing. And I think in this budget, there is a very significant reserve that's out there on the Capitol side, infrastructure, and that will help us and is meant to really make us stronger through an eventual decline, so that we don't have to go through all those cuts. And I think the mayor said that yesterday, that would be the goal, right, is if we get to another downturn, he has established sufficient reserves so that we won't have to start laying people off, slashing library hours again, doing all of those things. So I think that the budget is incredibly responsible in that way, and the mayor is definitely looking into the future, as he should.